When Fernando stepped into his own laundry room earlier than anyone expected, he almost dropped his briefcase. The sight stopped him cold. His daughter, Sofia, sat laughing with dusty feet on the shoulders of the family's bodyguard, Júlia, while towels and shirts draped on a drying rack swayed like flags behind them. Júlia had a towel wrapped around her head like a misfit crown, and she was humming, a soft, steady tune that had the impossible effect of making the whole room feel smaller and kinder. The housekeeper paused mid-fold. The cook froze with a spoon in the air. For the first time in a long time, someone in that house was simply at peace. Fernando felt something physical untether inside him, embarrassment, disbelief, and a sharper thing, a hollow he had been pretending wasn't there for 2 years. Marina had been gone 2 years. The accident had been sudden. The funerals, the calls, the suits, the decisions that followed, they had all been loud, furiously practical ways to avoid saying the one small thing that remained. A little girl had stopped speaking, and the world had become quieter, and he, more than anyone, had let silence grow into a wall. Sofia turned her face down from Júlia's shoulder, eyes bright as wet stones. She mouthed something like a giggle and reached for the towel around Júlia's head. Júlia tucked a stray curl behind Sofia's ear with the same care a surgeon had for a delicate seam. Fernando could see the way the child's shoulders relaxed, the way her hands unclenched. It was such an ordinary, human thing that he found himself imagining it in a different life, a life Marina would have recognized and loved. He did what he had always done when he felt exposed. He asserted control. The words left him before thought could temper them. "What is this?" he barked. "Who let you treat my house like a playground? Who taught her that?" A dozen pairs of eyes slid toward him. The room's warmth pulled taut and then snapped. Júlia straightened. Her posture was trained to physical readiness, years of drills and weightlifting and protocol, but there was softness in her voice that money could not buy. "She was scared," she said simply. "The dryer scared her, sir. When she got anxious, she wanted to climb. I carried her until she calmed down." "You carried my daughter on your shoulders in the laundry, in my house, in front of my staff?" I could feel his pulse in his throat. The pressure of other people's witnessing pushed him to perform. "You are a professional. You have boundaries." The words weren't untrue. They were missing the rest of the truth. In his train of diplomacy, Fernando had learned to mistake distance for dignity. He had long convinced himself that protecting his family meant keeping his emotions and his staff compartmentalized. Now he used that very compartmentalization as a weapon. Júlia lowered her eyes. "I was watching her. I put her down when you came in."
"You're fired," Fernando said, softer now, as if the administrative finality might steady his hands. "Leave by tonight. You know the terms." There was a murmur. Dona Beatriz, the house manager, held a dish towel in both hands like a talisman. Júlia's face tightened, but she did not argue. She had been hired as protection, not as a nanny, not as a friend. She had worn the title like armor for 2 years, and armor rarely fit a person entirely. Sofia's smile vanished. The small sound she had made dissolved into the kind of silence that filled rooms with weight. She straightened, as if bracing for a storm, and then walked, deliberately, to the window and pressed her forehead against the glass. No one moved to stop her. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, and for the second time that afternoon, Fernando felt unmanned by his own choices. If this had been an accident, it would have been manageable, but the weeks that followed were not. Sofia's progress, such as it was, had been fragile. She had shown up in patches, a day at the piano where a single note found its way free, a lazy summer afternoon where she hummed while arranging daisies, a corner of a smile at the aquarium when a whale shark came close. Each tiny victory had been cataloged in private like contraband, proof that grief could be interrupted. Now all those small triumphs retreated. Nightmares returned that same week, vivid and loud. Sofia began to refuse food she had once loved. She stopped going to the window. She began instead to wait by the laundry room door, as if time was a loop and Júlia would open it. She would sit there for hours, holding a threadbare cloth doll, eyes fixed on the closed door, as if the next breath through it might be the one she had been holding for 2 years. Dona Beatriz found Fernando in the study late one night. The house, too large for mourning, seemed to breathe in with him. "Sir," she said,
sitting like a quiet accusation. "Before you do something you'll regret, there's something you should know." "What?" She made her speak, Dona Beatriz said, voice low and steady, the way she had catalogued the household accounts for 20 years. 2 months ago, in the servants' quarters, Sofia whispered, "Mama," when no one was listening. It was with Júlia. Fernando's hand tightened around the arm of the chair. "What do you mean?" she spoke. "Not like she used to," Beatriz corrected. "A soft sound, like a small child testing a toy. But it was the first sound in 2 years, sir. It was the start of something." She sat with her every afternoon, kept to herself, let her lead. She made a routine. She hummed, she sang old lullabies, if you will. One she learned from her grandmother, I think. She's not a nanny. She's a guard, yes, but she became something else, someone she trusted. Guilt, once a dull ache, flared into a white heat. Fernando heard his own echo from the laundry room. "You're fired."
The words had felt like order. Now they sounded like the wrong chemical in an experiment. He tried to reason. He had been out of town, making deals, arranging a trust, performing the motions of a man responsible. He had done the necessary things, but he had not done the hardest one. He had not listened. That night, Fernando stopped sleeping. He stopped believing in the easy arrangements he had made between money and care. He began to search, not in the glossy corners of the city, where people like him kept their failures tidy, but in the places that had birthed Júlia. Low-rise apartments with patched roofs, a narrow alley where children played tag on broken pavement, a shared kitchen where the scent of frying onions was as constant as the sun. He found Júlia in the back room of a small flat, where 2 younger people and a child moved like planets around her. Rafael, a lanky teenager with work-worn hands, was studying by the light of an old lamp. Amanda, a woman with a baby and a cup of tea that was forever going cold, looked up with cautious hope. A small boy, Miguel, chased a crumpled paper ball and tripped in front of their shoes. When she opened the door and saw who had come, Júlia's face hardened into its professional mask. "You should not have come here, sir," she said. Fernando wanted to be dramatic. He found instead that his voice cracked. "I came to apologize," he said. The words were small, embarrassingly human. "I was wrong. I fired you before I knew, before I understood. I want you back." Júlia measured him in silence. She was not small. She had trained to be visible and unflappable. She had also read enough of life to know that apologies often came bundled with expectations. "You humiliated me in front of the staff," she said at last. "You displayed me like a cautionary tale, and I have a family." "I know," Fernando said. "You have my pardon. I'll give you whatever you need." She laughed once, not unkindly. "Sir, you can buy whatever you want. I don't want your pity wrapped in banknotes." Her eyes flicked to her brother and sister, and then to little Miguel, who had stopped playing to watch the exchange like it was a play he'd seen before. "I want respect. I want the job title to mean what it says. If you want me back, I will come, but I will not be invisible. I will be officially employed as Sofia's caregiver, with hours, with duties. I am not your charity. I will also ask one thing. Pay for Rafael and Amanda to finish school. Let them be more than what this neighborhood expects. And I want to finish my degree. I will not teach your daughter only on instinct. I will train. If you cannot do those things, do not ask me to heal what you broke." There it was, agency in plain sight. Júlia's list was not a demand for a life he had not imagined. It was a plan. It was a map from survival to dignity. For the first time since Marina's death, Fernando felt the heat of responsibility shift from the theater of his pride to the simple, heavy work of repair. He wanted to save her, like one buys a lost heirloom, but Júlia would not be an heirloom. "I can do it," he said. "I will make the arrangements. I will personally fund their education. I'll have a contract drawn up. I'll hire you as a caregiver with a respectable salary and benefits. I will pay for your studies. Everything you asked." She let the words settle. "Then come with me tomorrow," she said, "not to beg, but to offer. I will let Sofia decide." When Fernando returned to the house and told the staff, he felt a tremor of shame, but he pushed it down. Apologies are fragile instruments. Dona Beatrice watched him with a look that had been tempered by a lifetime in service. "The man who is brave is not the one who wins in the boardroom," she told him once, quietly, "but the one who kneels when he needs it." He took that to heart. A week later, in the servants' hall, where gossip was a kind of justice, Fernando did something that would have been scandalous at any corporate ethics seminar, but felt right in that narrow room. He kneeled. Not theatrically, not for cameras. He lowered himself in front of a small circle of people who had spent years keeping his household from unraveling, and offered his apology with more humility than any press release could have summarized. "I was wrong," he said. "I fired someone who saved my child from herself. I misused my authority. I humbly ask for forgiveness." Júlia watched, as did the others. The air smelled of boiled coffee and the sharp, clean scent of floor polish. Some nodded, some did not. Forgiveness is a process, not an instant ritual. But that public kneel made the wrong visible. Invisibility is the first stage of change. They went slowly after that. Sofia did not wake magically in the morning with all words restored. Recovery is arc, not crescendo. Júlia returned to the house under a signed contract that recognized her role and paid her like a professional. Her days were structured: therapeutic music sessions, walks in the garden, practice with speech exercises recommended by professionals the family could afford because of Fernando's resources. Júlia remained steadfastly herself. She taught Sofia grounding exercises, not because they were trendy therapies, but because she had once steadied a frightened child's breath with her hands when a thunderstorm had felt like a war. At night, when the house was quiet and two adults kept vigil over a small sleeping body, conversations found their way to confessions. Fernando began aloud to remember Marina in specifics he had hoarded like artifacts behind glass: the way she arranged napkins at dinner, the cadence of her laugh, the way she wrote little notes on Sofia's lunchbox that smelled of lemon soap and hope. Júlia listened.
She never spoke ill of Marina. She only showed how memory could live alongside new affection. There was one hospital night that would come to feel like a pivot for them all. Sofia had a fever that ran high and stubborn. The pediatrician was cautious, the machines gentle with their flat noises. Fernando sat in a chair that betrayed him with squeaks. Júlia sat on the floor by the bedside, one hand pressed to Sofia's hair as if to pin the fever down. Sofia woke at one point, eyes glassy, and looked straight at Júlia. The night was small, focused, like a lens. "Júlia," she whispered, voice thin as a reed, but real. "You're like Mom, but—" And the sentence almost fell apart, the old grief trying to hold itself together. "You don't make my heart hurt." The room exhaled. Fernando's chest gave in a way that felt like sorrow and relief knitting together. He lifted a hand and rested it lightly on Júlia's shoulder. No grand pronouncement, no exchange of vows, just the simple human contact of two people who had walked through fire and found one another in the ash. Time moved on. Sofia's speech returned slowly, a word here, a sentence there. Her laughter came back in a manner that was cautious but resilient. She learned to ask for what she wanted, to say no when pushed, to name things that once had been nameless. Her relationship with Júlia deepened into a secure attachment that allowed her to love again without erasing the past. Marina's memory remained a bright, untouchable thing in the house, a portrait that hung in the hall, a rosebush Marina had planted leaning stubbornly toward the sun. Júlia kept her promises. She enrolled in courses, then a degree program that focused on early childhood education and trauma-informed care. Her siblings received scholarships and attended school regularly. Rafael found a job that allowed him to study evenings. Amanda took courses in community health. These were incremental shifts, not fairy tale reversals. They paid rent, sometimes late. They argued over grocery lists and celebrated small raises like holidays. Fernando changed in ways that mattered. He learned to step back. He learned to ask rather than dictate, to fund without taking over, to listen in the silence rather than fill it with decisions. He reorganized his foundation to support community initiatives that respected local leadership rather than imposing solutions. He learned, by example, that dignity cannot be purchased. It must be acknowledged and returned. There were quieter pressures, too. Staff gossip sometimes took on a cruel edge, as it always does when power shifts. There were boardroom whispers about the unconventional arrangement,
a billionaire funding the education of a bodyguard who had in public been dismissed. But Fernando endured the friction like a patient man, because the stakes were not his pride. His daughter's life was the true account he ought to balance.
Years later, a modest building opened its doors as a community center and training school, a project of the newly refocused foundation. It was not a marble monument. It was a plastered, practical place with classrooms that smelled of chalk and cleaning solution, and a garden where roses, Marina's roses, bent stubbornly into bloom. Júlia's methods formed the core of the curriculum: safety first, acknowledgement second, education as liberation. The local press called it an experiment. The families who had attended called it home. But the new pattern held more often than not: repair in practice, not in rhetoric. In the quiet moments, Fernando would walk the garden and talk to Marina as if she were on the next path. He would tell her small things, about Sofia's first recital after the recovery, about the day Júlia defended a family at a community meeting. He would say out loud the apologies he had never had the courage to deliver. Sometimes, in those walks, he felt a gentle approval in how the roses leaned. On a late afternoon, years after he had almost fainted in the laundry room, the three of them, Fernando, Júlia, and Sofia, sat on a bench beneath a trellis heavy with roses. Sofia, now quick with words, told a small story about a school recital where she had been nervous, and Júlia had tied her shoes and hummed until her hands stopped shaking. Júlia watched her with the same quiet pride a mother bears. Fernando listened, feeling both full and empty, grateful for the strange alchemy that had turned his worst mistake into the scaffold of their family. Sofia reached out and took both of their hands, small palms and larger ones. "I like this," she said. "I have a garden and 2 mothers, and Miguel has bugs in his pocket." She said it simply, the way children do, folding complexities into statements that are breathtaking in their plainness. There was one last thing Fernando had promised early on, in the heat of his remorse: a public restitution. He made a speech once at a general assembly for the foundation, where he spoke not of his successes, but of his failures. He told the story, the laundry room, the firing, the finding, and he told it with the kind of honesty that leaves little room for applause, but opens a space for accountability. "I assumed authority would make me right," he said. "I was wrong. I learned that dignity is not given by a title. It is returned by action. To Júlia, to Sofia, and to my family, I am sorry. I will spend whatever years I have making that right." Júlia sat on the front row. She had no mask that day. There was a softness in her face that made her human in a way that titles could never accomplish. When he finished, she stood and walked up and embraced him, not in a way that erased her past, but in a way that honored the path they had both chosen. The room stood for them because standing felt like the only honest response to such a transformation. Years later, when Miguel, now a boy with an honest joke and a future unstuck from the patterns that had bound his parents' generation, chased butterflies near the foundation's new playground, Fernando would sometimes sit and open his small photo album. Photos of Marina smiling at Sofia with a finger to her lips, photos of Júlia at graduation, photos of a wedding cake that was intentionally modest. He kept them in order. The roses in the garden did what roses always do: bloom and then shed, leaving the scent to remind them of what had been and what had become.
The story that began with a man almost fainting in a laundry room ended not with a grand reversal, but with the slow, steady work of tending. People who had once been peripheral became central. A bodyguard turned caregiver became an educator and a leader. A billionaire learned how to kneel without theatrics and to stand up for people who had been dismissed. A child found her voice, and in the voice, a place for the past and the new to live side by side. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this small truth: dignity matters more than drama. Respect shapes the course of healing in ways that money alone cannot. And sometimes, the person who saves us is the one we least expect. Not a savior, but a steady hand and a stubborn refusal to let a child be alone. If this story touched you, subscribe for more true feel tales about second chances and quiet courage. Leave a comment. Would you have forgiven the way Fernando did? Share your thoughts. They planted one last rose the day the foundation turned 5, a bush with blooms the color of dusk and fire. Sofia knelt to pat the soil with both hands. Júlia stood behind her, hands on her shoulders.
Fernando watched from the path, the sun catching a gray at his temples. He thought of Marina and of the laundry room, and of the many small refusals that had led to this day. Sofia looked up and smiled. "We are enough," she said, as if reciting a lesson. The roses answered by opening one more petal to the sky. The past did not vanish. It simply found a place in the garden, a memory watered by new care. And that was a kind of miracle, not the sudden cure of a fever, but the slow, patient tending of what had been broken, so that it might at last bloom.